Chapter 11. Colin required several long seconds to digest this information. During that time he tried to quiet the screaming voices in his head that cried out in protest at the unfairness of it all. Luna was perfect. Perfect. Except not. Really, not according to his exacting standards. I understand this probably changes everything, she said. You may not want a half-breed running the inn, but I am right for the job and no one here knows about my mother. I plan to keep it that way in case someone else might feel the way y'all do. Colin scrubbed a hand over his face. Now everything she told him made sense. Her mother had run away because she didn't want to be part of a werewolf pack. She wouldn't have told Luna that she might inherit the ability to shift, because there was a 50% chance she wouldn't. Then her mother had died before Luna reached puberty, and Luna had gone through her first shift with no support at all. That's why you went through your first shift alone. She waved her hand dismissively. Yes, but that doesn't matter now. It does. He walked toward her, his heart aching for the young girl who hadn't known what was happening to her. Of course it does. He took her by the shoulders. I'm so sorry. When she lifted her face to his, a mask of indifference covered the open delight he was used to seeing there. It's not your problem. And it shouldn't have been yours either. He wanted her to tell him about that first shift, because he sensed she'd never been able to unburden herself to anyone. He was the only person in the world who knew she was a half-breed. No wonder she'd decided not to contact her grandparents. Look, the primary issue here is whether I still have a job running the inn. If I don't, then maybe I can train Sybil to do it. Janet's needed back in the kitchen, and Dulcie's a little too focused on the male of the species, but I think Sybil might. I don't want Sybil. He released her because he realized she wouldn't confide in him, not after the way he'd talked about humans mating with Wers. And he still believed it was a mistake. Luna was proof of the heartbreak it could bring. Then let me find someone else, do some interviewing. Just don't throw out the idea of the inn because I'm not right for the job. Sybil, Dulcie, and Janet deserve a chance to stay on and make a go of this. I gave you my word that you could run the inn. She swallowed. That was before I told you I'm a half-breed. He looked into green eyes that had been full of joy not long ago, and now were as cold and hard as a piece of jade. You're still the same talented and capable were who impressed me before. I have no doubt that you'll do an excellent job. I want you to stay. Her shoulders sagged in relief. Thank you. No, I need to thank you. If you hadn't come up with this alternative, I would have listed the property with that dullard Regis and lost any right to come back here. All those cherished memories would have been stripped away. She nodded. I'm glad that didn't happen. And I would have missed spending last night with you. Her gaze snapped to his. Under the circumstances, you should forget about that. I've already given you my word that I'll never forget. She stared at him and gradually her mask slipped back into place. I release you from that pledge, Colin. I'm sure my secret is safe because it wouldn't help business to reveal it. If y'all will excuse me, I have work to do. Turning, she marched back toward the steps, her back straight in her head. Hi. At the steps, she glanced back at him. I'll print out the spreadsheet for those financial projections and leave it under your bedroom door. Luna, don't put this kind of distance between us. I was your friend before, and I want to keep that friendship. I care about you. He cared more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. But he'd held his beliefs too long and too passionately to toss them aside. He hoped she understood that. She stood gazing at the sand beneath her feet for several seconds. When her response finally came, it was so low that he had to strain to hear it over the sound of the waves. She didn't raise her head, didn't look at him. Is it the sex? Is that what y'all want? Bloody hell. No, it's not the sex. She lifted her gaze to his. That's good, because it won't ever happen again. Breaking eye contact, she turned and went up the steps. He watched her until she was out of sight. He fought the urge to throw back his head and howl. He was already worried that someone might have heard his last shouted comment, which had, unfortunately, included the word sex. That comment, followed by a howl of despair, wasn't a bright idea right now. Luna ate breakfast at her desk while she cleaned up the spreadsheet that compared similar inns in the area with Whittier House, number of rooms, room rate, and amenities. She'd used her hotel experience to project the costs of food and beverages per person, and built that into the room rate. They'd have to serve 3 meals a day because nothing else was available without leaving the island. She buried herself in the work she loved, the work that would give her a haven, away from a world that wouldn't welcome her if her heritage became known. Maybe other Wers didn't share Colin's prejudices, but she'd never had the courage to broach the subject for fear something she said would give her away. She fussed with the spreadsheet for too long, but she wanted it to be beyond reproach. Besides, as long as she worked in her office with the door closed, she could avoid Colin. Sometime before noon she ventured out, the spreadsheet in a manila envelope with his name on it. On the way up the stairs to the second floor she had to pass Dulcie, who was polishing the wooden banisters on either side of the marble staircase. There you are. Dulcie put down her cloth and bottle of lemon oil. I've been dying to find out how everything went last night. Did huddling over those projections turn into anything exciting? Luna took a deep breath. No, she wasn't a good liar, and she felt the heat rush to her cheeks. Ah, that's okay, honey. Dulcie patted her arm. Don't be embarrassed. Probably shouldn't have asked, but you know we all want you to find a hunky or who can give you some action. We, took bets on whether Colin would be the lucky one. Bets? Luna was scandalized. Dulcie tugged at the hem of her rhinestone-studded shirt and had the good grace to look a little uncomfortable. Well, we saw the way he looked at you. And after you left the kitchen last night, we finished off the wine, which led to a little friendly wager. Innocent fun. Despite being scandalized, Luna was intrigued. No one had ever paid enough attention to her activities to place a wager on the outcome. How did you bet? I put my money on you two doing the nasty last night. Janet thought it would take longer, and Sybil's convinced you're a virgin and nothing will happen. Because you won't take that kind of chance with your new boss. Luna glanced away, not wanting Dulcie to read anything from her expression. You did it, didn't you? No, she looked Dulcie straight in the eye and reminded herself of Colin's rigid belief system. Sybil's right. I wouldn't risk my future like that. Apparently she was convincing because Dulcie sighed. If you say so. I've already lost then, but Janet's holding the money until Colin goes back to Scotland because she and Sybil still have a bet. How much money are we talking about? She hoped it wasn't a small fortune. But after a couple of glasses of wine, the Wers might have become reckless. $20 each. An amount we can afford to lose, which obviously I will. Damn. I thought Colin was more assertive than that. Is somebody accusing me of not being assertive? Luna glanced up and wished she hadn't stopped to talk with Dulcie. Now she was trapped. Colin stood at the top of the stairs looking gorgeous as ever. The rat. No one should be that handsome. Despite what he'd said this morning, she still craved his body. He'd obviously showered and changed clothes since this morning. He wore khaki slacks and a crisp white dress shirt open at the neck. Plus he smelled like heaven on earth, a combination of natural musk and a cologne that he'd probably brought from Scotland. She didn't know what the scent of heather was like, but logically Colin would bring the aroma of Scotland with him. She held out the manila envelope. You saved me a trip. I was coming up to slip this under your door. He came down the steps with an easy stride that seemed to say he hadn't a care in the world. But his blue eyes searched her expression and lines of weariness bracketed his mouth. Thanks for putting this together. He took the envelope. Actually, I was coming to look for you. Yesterday we talked about taking a trip into Seattle to look for books, and I've arranged for the helicopter to pick us up. Can you be ready in the next hour? Well, no. She hadn't expected him to take charge like this, and she scrambled for a reasonable excuse. Janet and I need to start planning menus that are in line with my cost projections, and this afternoon is the best. Janet can adjust, Dulcie said. You two go on. Have fun. You haven't had a trip to Seattle in months, Luna. You deserve it. Surely she could get out of this tangled web. It's a nice thought, but considering all that has to be done in preparation for opening the inn, I can't take the time. We need to see about advertising, and all the rooms will have to be evaluated in terms of linens, and I also think we should consider installing a hot tub. She glanced at Colin, a plea in her eyes. I couldn't possibly get away. He ignored that plea. Sure you can. We'll price hot tubs while we're in Seattle, maybe even buy one. I agree, it's a great idea. So is the library. We talked about, and it needs books unless you plan to empty Henry's collection. Dulcie waved her polishing cloth in Luna's direction. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Let his lairdness of Glen Bilbo take you hot tub shopping. She waggled her eyebrows. Could we set aside a few hours for staff use of the hot tub? Of course. Colin gave her his high-wattage smile. I believe in keeping the staff happy. He glanced over at Luna. Meet you at the helipad in 45 minutes. I'll ask Janet to pack us a lunch to eat on the way. He continued on. Down the stairs. Dulcie flapped her hand in front of her face. Phew, that were as hot. If y'all like the type. Luna struggled for nonchalance and was afraid she'd failed miserably. What are you talking about? He's a stud. Every female in the world would like his type were a human. What's the matter with you? I just don't think it's a good idea to mix business with pleasure. The hypocrisy of that statement made her tummy hurt, but she was battling for her very existence and compromises had to be made. Dulcie rolled her eyes. I can see that Sybil has this one in the bag. I knew you were a straight arrow, but I didn't think you were quite this straight. But here's a tip. Don't piss off the boss, even if you don't want to play footsie with him when he invites you to Seattle to shop for books and hot tubs. You go to Seattle and shop for books and hot tubs. Y'all have a point. Luna hadn't figured that Colin would pull rank on her. But he had, and in front of Dulcie, which had worked out well for him, she couldn't refuse to go without seeming to sabotage the entire operation, and that she definitely didn't want to do. You bet your sweet ass I have a point. Power to the sisterhood, girlfriend. We're counting on you to keep that we're happy. Dulcie glanced at Luna's sweatshirt and jeans, which she'd been wearing since last night. I suggest you clean up a little bit too. I hate to say it, but your hair's a hot mess. Luna instinctively touched her hair and realized she hadn't done a thing with it since rolling around in Colin's bed, followed by walking along a misty, windblown beach. She hadn't bothered to look in a mirror, but had headed straight to the office and barricaded herself in there to work on the spreadsheets. She probably looked deranged. That wasn't far off. The past couple of days had taken their toll on her, and she only hoped she could hold on to her sanity until Colin boarded a plane and headed back to his native land. She wanted nothing more than to be left alone. No, that wasn't true either. There were moments when she wanted nothing more than to strip naked and welcome Colin into her outstretched arms. But she throttled those urges every time they arose. She wasn't about to give her body to someone who disapproved of her ancestry. If sex was the only thing that would keep him happy, then they'd all get kicked out of Whittier House. But she could be reasonably accommodating, so she showered, washed her hair, and dressed in a flowered summery frock, another of Geraldine's gifts to her. Of course Geraldine hadn't known about Luna's unorthodox background either, but Luna hoped that Geraldine wouldn't have cared. She defied the MacDowell clan to mate with a foreigner from Vancouver. Still, that wasn't the same as being descended from a human mother and a father. Luna hadn't chosen that for herself, and sadly, she could understand Colin's objections to mingling the two species. The impetuous mating between her mother and father had caused her plenty of anguish. Yet now she lived in a castle with other friendly Wers. Assuming Colin didn't go back on his word, she had a chance to make a nice living for herself and her new friends. She didn't think he would go back on his word, but refusing a simple request to accompany him to Seattle wasn't very smart. She strapped on a pair of sandals, grabbed a straw purse and her sunglasses, and walked out the door to the helipad. This was a simple request, wasn't it? She could manage to browse through a few bookstores and check on hot tubs without turning the day into a complicated dance. Colin stood beside the helicopter, his hair tousled by the wind from the chopper blades, his wayfarers making him look like a flyboy himself. Paper bag dangled loosely from his long fingers. Giving the two men a wave, she ducked under the swirling blades and joined them next to the cockpit. Hi Knox. She become friends with him through the many times he'd taken Geraldine on shopping trips, but he'd earned her total respect the night he'd flown in the medical team. Despite being a Trevelyan, the pack Geraldine and Henry had ignored, he'd grieved right along with Luna, as Geraldine had lost her fight for life. Beautiful day for a trip to the city, Knox shouted above the noise of the rotor. I'll put Colin in back and you next to me like we did the time Geraldine took you shopping. Luna nodded. The seating arrangement had been Geraldine's idea, because she'd wanted Luna to have the full experience of flying over the sparkling water, and into the city. Despite Luna's mild acrophobia, she wasn't bothered by riding in a helicopter, possibly because she was strapped in and someone else was in charge of getting them safely back to ground level. Trevelyan Enterprises had its own helipad at the top of one of Seattle's office buildings. It was an elegant and quick way into the heart of the Emerald City, and Luna had enjoyed her trip with Geraldine. Colin glanced at her, but she couldn't read his expression behind his dark glasses. "You look great," he said in a voice barely loud enough to carry over the roar of the helicopter. "Thanks." She turned away. From now on, every interaction between them would be strictly business. Chapter 12. Colin climbed into the helicopter. The picture Luna had made as she walked toward the helipad in that flowery dress and big dark glasses, her glossy hair shining in the sun, would join all the other images etched permanently in his memory. Her beauty made his heart ache with longing for the uncomplicated connection they'd had the night before. He'd arranged for the helicopter in hopes he'd be able to coax her aboard. She'd refused to come. He would have gone alone. He had more than books and hot tubs on his mind. He wanted to meet Luna's grandparents. He wouldn't give her away, but he wanted to assess whether they might be a support system for her. Perhaps she would never confide in him again after the things he'd said this morning, but she carried a heavy burden knowing she was half-were. If her grandparents were compassionate and trustworthy, they might become the family she'd never had. He'd already done some research online using the netbook he'd brought with him, and a secure site dedicated to Werewolfs. The site had been live for only a few months, so Luna might not know about it, but her grandparents obviously did. Edwina and Jacques Reynaud used the site to promote their new venture, the Byron Reynaud Foundation, which benefited orphaned or displaced Werewolfs. Judging from the information Colin found, the Reynauds were kind and generous souls who decided to devote their golden years to doing good works. They didn't seem like the sort to reject a granddaughter who provided the only connection to their beloved son. Colin wasn't sure how Luna would react when he told her how he'd spent his morning, but she needed to know what he'd been up to, and a trip to Seattle would give them plenty of time to discuss it. If all went well, they might chance a visit to the Reynauds, although Luna might choose not to identify herself as their granddaughter. But first he'd needed to get Luna to Seattle. Barging into her office with a suggestion hadn't seemed right, and then fortune had smiled on him. With less than an hour before takeoff, he'd met her on the stairway and coerced her into coming along. Having Dulcie there to support his plan had been a bonus. Luna hadn't wanted to go, which didn't surprise him, but he was willing to manipulate the situation to get her into the chopper and on her way to Seattle. He'd insulted her background and caused her pain when he'd wanted to give her joy. She was right to ignore him now, but he fervently hoped that eventually she might connect with her grandparents. Having family again might make up for the fact that he'd unwittingly forced her to reveal her secret. He passed out the lunch, sandwiches all around, and those silly little juice boxes Americans were so fond of. The helicopter ride was as noisy this morning as it had been the last time he'd flown over Puget Sound. He sat back and tried not to be bothered by the easy interaction between Knox and Luna. Knox took pains to give her a good show, pointing out sights and angling the chopper so she could see more easily. When they flew over a pod of orchis, Luna pressed her nose to the window until they were out of sight, and then gave Knox a dazzling smile and a thumbs up. Colin ground his teeth together, not happy with being odd man out even if he deserved it. She used to smile at him like that, but thanks to the phone call and what came afterward, she'd stopped smiling when she looked at him. God, how he missed her smile. He tried to convince himself a friendship between Knox and Luna was a good thing. Now that Colin had removed Luna's fear of sex, she was free to explore that side of her nature, and she should after being celibate for so long. He'd been lucky to be her first lover, but he didn't expect to be her last. Knox Trevelyan seemed like a considerate, intelligent sort, someone who would appreciate Luna's finer qualities. Once the inn opened for business, Knox would fly guests over on a regular basis. He might even park the chopper on the helipad and stay the night. Colin's jaw tightened. Yes, it would be extremely noble of him to give his blessing to a sexual relationship between Knox and Luna, but he wasn't that noble. Fortunately, he'd be in Scotland and wouldn't know what was going on. He'd suspect they would gravitate toward each other though, and his imagination would torture him with images of Knox and Luna together. By the time Knox landed the helicopter on the roof of the Trevelyan Enterprises building in downtown Seattle, Colin was in a mood. He had no bloody right to be in a mood either. He had no claim on Luna and would never have one. But no matter how many times he told himself that, whenever he looked at her, something primitive inside him howled mine. Well, too bad. He was a civilized one who wasn't ruled by his primitive instincts, thank God. He would have mated with Luna last night. He went very still, mesmerized by that unacceptable thought, that hovered, unacknowledged, in the back of his mind ever since he'd met her. He'd agreed that she could run the inn, but some part of him had known that he had other plans for her. Those plans hadn't risen to a conscious level because his pack would object to an American with no pack affiliation. He would have had to win them over gradually, but he could have done it. However, he was caught in a trap of his own making. Taking Luna as his mate would contradict his belief that the races shouldn't mix. He still held that belief, so mating with her was out of the question. Unfortunately, knowing that didn't stop him from wanting her with a desperation that he'd never felt with another female. Colin. Knox poked his head in through the passenger door of the chopper. You coming out? That's when he realized the rotors were quiet and both Luna and Knox stood outside the helicopter waiting for him to climb down. He wondered how long he'd been sitting there looking totally daft. Sorry. He extricated his sizable body from the small space. I was thinking about something and lost track of where I was. Obviously. Knox laughed. You were gone, man. Completely checked out. Admire that kind of concentration, though. He held out his hand. Have a great time in the city. Thanks. Colin shook Knox's hand and resisted the urge to apply a little more pressure as a warning that he was a word to be reckoned with. How juvenile was that? Still planning to head back around midnight? Midnight. Luna shoved her glasses to the top of her head and stared at him. I can't stay until midnight, Colin. I have several things to humor me. He smiled at her, knowing she wouldn't smile back at him the way she had with that cheeky bastard Knox. I haven't had dinner at the top of the Space Needle since Geraldine brought me here as a teenager. I made reservations for 9 so we could watch the sunset and see the lights come on. It's spectacular. Her eyes narrowed. 12 hours ago she would have greeted that story with a soft gaze filled with understanding. Well, that wouldn't be happening anymore. Clearly she suspected him of being devious, which was right on the mark. You'll love the view from the Space Needle, Luna, Knox said. As long as you're here you should see it, and the real show doesn't happen until after dark. She turned to Knox, and all the concern Colin used to enjoy was focused on the pilot. Bless your heart for thinking of me, Knox. But then y'all will be up until the wee small hours of the morning. That seems very selfish of us. She flicked a glance at Colin that plainly said it was selfish of him. Hey, Colin pays me well for it, and besides I get a kick out of night flying. You go enjoy the Space Needle, and then I'll show you some pretty night views on the way home. Colin wondered if it was too late to request a different pilot, a graying, paunchy pilot. All right, Knox. Luna favored him with another warm smile. You've convinced me. Take care. She pulled her dark glasses over her eyes before turning to Colin. Shall we go? Yes. Colin felt a stabbing pain in his right temple. That vein in your temple is standing out again, Luna murmured conversationally as they walked toward the rooftop doorway leading down into the building. Colin noticed that he no longer rated a bless your heart either. I'm not surprised. Luna had never been wooed before, and she couldn't imagine why it was happening now, except that Colin must have liked the sex and wanted more of. He might think a romantic dinner at the top of the Space Needle would do the trick, but it would be a cold day in hell before she climbed back into bed with him. He could fly her to Paris for dinner and she still wouldn't get naked for him. But she couldn't afford to tick him off either. He'd promised that their personal relationship would have nothing to do with their business relationship, and so far he'd kept his word. But Dulcie was right. Playing along, at least when it came to the business side of their relationship, was the best plan. I thought we'd visit a hot tub showroom first, Colin said as they rode in elevator down to the lobby of the Trevelyan Enterprises building. He tucked his wayfarers into an inner pocket of his designer sport coat. We'll need to drive a ways because I checked and there aren't any in the heart of the city. I wondered about that. She'd wondered a lot of things about this apparently impromptu trip. Are you going to drive? She was pretty sure Scottish people used the wrong side of the road, which could make for some tense moments if Colin planned to take the wheel. He glanced at her. Worried that I'll get us both killed? A little. Well, you can relax. I've arranged for a driver. When? I didn't mention the hot tub until an hour before we left Whittier House. I contacted George Trevelyan right after I talked to you. He gave me the name of a good dealer and offered the loan of a car. Oh, Luna had always suspected there were advantages to being well connected in the world. She'd never had that going for her, not even with Geraldine, who'd been a maverick. Geraldine had never traded on her status as a MacDowell once she left Scotland and had seemed proud of the fact. Luna thought of something else. Was it difficult to get a reservation at the restaurant on short notice? George took care of that too. He made sure we had a table. That George is a handiwork to have around. Yes, he is. Colin gazed at the numbers flashing by on the elevator and consulted his watch. We're right on time. Apparently it was an express elevator because they were in the sparkling marble and gold lobby before Luna had a chance to ask any more questions. Colin put a hand to the small of her back, a subtle gesture to guide her toward the revolving doors leading to the street. She moved out of reach and walked a little faster. His touch still had the power to affect her, damn it. So did those electric blue eyes. When he'd mentioned wanting to eat at the top of the Space Needle for old time's sake, he'd managed to tug at her heartstrings for a split second. She'd quickly squashed that reaction. This entire trip had ulterior motive written all over it. Stepping quickly into one wedge of the revolving door, she made her way out to the sidewalk. A white stretch limo sat at the curb, engine idling. Surely Colin hadn't hired a limo to take them hot tub shopping. He joined her on the sidewalk, and immediately the driver climbed out and opened the passenger door. Luna glanced back at him. Seriously? It's what George had available. All the town cars were in service. I hope y'all realize that pulling up to a hot tub store in a limo will ruin any chance of getting a bargain. Colin smiled. You've obviously forgotten that I'm a Scot. We always get a bargain. Now that was funny. She had to clamp her lips together to keep from laughing. It wouldn't kill you to smile, Luna. Instead of answering, she ducked into the limo. Too bad she liked Colin so much. Well, she liked him a lot except when she didn't like him at all. When he graced her with that amazing smile, the one that made her heart race and her body tremble, then she absolutely hated him. She'd never ridden in a limo before, and when confronted with something that resembled a living room sectional, she couldn't figure out where to sit. The back seemed safest because at least she'd be facing forward like in a normal car. She eased down on the black leather and gave an inadvertent hum of pleasure. How embarrassing. She didn't want Colin to know that she liked the luxury ride that he was providing, or George Trevelyan was providing, because he and Colin had some sort of alpha male mutual back-scratching thing. But she had to admit, this was the nicest upholstery her tush had ever enjoyed. She held her straw purse on her lap, because clutching it gave her something to hold onto in this cavernous space that held a scent of oiled leather and a light perfume that might be an air freshener. The driver seemed miles away. Colin sat right next to her, of course, bringing with him his maddeningly sexy scent. She could have predicted that he'd plop down right where she was, his thigh touching her thigh. She wasn't about to put up with that. The brush of his pants leg against her dress was far too erotic to go on for even 1 minute. She moved a few inches to the right and he didn't follow. His pride probably wouldn't allow him to chase her around the black leather. If things had remained the same as they once were between her and Colin, she would have joked with him that until now, she'd also been a limo virgin. But she wasn't in a joking mood, so she didn't say anything and pretended she'd been chauffeured like this dozens of times. The limo pulled out so smoothly that it took her a second to realize they were in traffic. Don't you have to tell him where to go? George told him. George also alerted the sales staff that we were coming and told them to give us their best price. That George. What a guy. Colin glanced at her. He asked if we'd come up to his office after we finish with the hot tub shopping. You should probably meet him. He'd be a valuable contact to have. I suppose he would. Colin was right. Geraldine might have prided herself on being totally self-sufficient, but Luna couldn't afford to operate that way if she expected to make a success of Whittier House. Then we should go to his office and thank him for the limo while we're at it. I'm sure he'd appreciate that. It's the polite thing to do. She gazed out the window at the bustling city and was swamped with memories of having to survive in such an environment on her own. Lufloret suited her so much better, and she hoped never to have to go back to the life she'd had before moving to the island. There's something I want to talk to you about. She turned back to him, all her senses on high alert. What's that? Have you heard about a secure website called Lupe? She shook her head. From the name I'm guessing it's for Wers? Yes. It was activated a few months ago. My brother who keeps up with such things told me about it. She relaxed her guard. So this was about business. If it would be a good place to advertise the inn, then I'll check into it. I hadn't heard of it, so I appreciate the tip. It would be a good place to advertise, but that's not why I mentioned it. Found something on there this morning that I thought you'd want to know about. Have you heard of the Luna Reynaud Foundation? She drew in a sharp breath. Hearing her father's name was always a shock to her system. No, I haven't. What is it? An organization to benefit orphaned and misplaced Wers. It's funded and supervised by your grandparents. Oh. She put a hand to her heart, as if she could soothe its frantic pounding. That's good, I guess. And what about her? She was an orphaned and misplaced Wer, and their granddaughter. But she couldn't go to them for support because if she told them Sophie was her mother, they would know she was a half-breed. After taking a steadying breath, she met his gaze. Thank y'all for telling me. I appreciate knowing, even if it did her no good. Then she had another thought. If this foundation becomes well known, then so will the name. Reynaud. Perhaps. I should be prepared with an answer if someone asks if I'm related since I live in the area. I don't want to stammer and look as if I'm lying. True. As the implications became clear, she groaned. My name will become more well known as the manager of the Whittier House Inn, especially if it's as successful as I plan for it to be, so it could work the other way too. Worse. Could ask my grandparents if they're related to me. I suppose, but I was thinking that this is not good, Colin. She kept her voice low so the chauffeur couldn't hear. The whole story could come out, which could be bad for business, not to mention embarrassing for you. I need to change my last name. Or you could consider meeting your grandparents and getting everything out in the open so it won't have the power to sabotage you later. She stared at him in astonishment. No, I could not. No telling how they'd react if they find out they're related to a half-breed. After your rant this morning, I'm more determined than ever to protect my secret. He flinched. Point taken. But Luna, you're their granddaughter, the only link to their dead son. I know telling them is risky, but your mother and father are gone. Wouldn't it be comforting to have family again? His tone of voice was what clued her in. She stopped focusing on the problem and looked more closely at those beautiful eyes. Sure enough, they were filled with sympathy and a certain amount of guilt. She had a flash of insight. I don't think y'all stumbled upon the Luna Reynaud Foundation by accident. No. I went looking for information about your grandparents. Why? I think you need them, Luna. Anger boiled beneath the surface, but she forced herself not to scream at him. They were in a limo after all. Whether I need them or don't need them is none of your business, Colin. I'm grateful for the information, so I won't be caught unaware. The best course of action would be to change my name so this will never become a problem. It's not going to be a problem. Of course it is. There's the potential for Wers to learn I'm a half-breed and shun me. Whittier House could lose business because of it. I could become a liability instead of an asset. Give Wers some credit, Luna. They won't blame you for something that wasn't your fault. Don't y'all? She put all the hurt from this morning into that one question. No. That's what I've been trying to say ever since this blew up. Your parents' choices wouldn't have been my choices, but that doesn't change the fact that you're wonderful no matter who your mother and father were. Didn't tell you about your grandparents because I was afraid it might hurt business at some time in the future. I told you because I want the best for you. She gazed at him and tried to make sense of it all. He still wanted her to manage the inn despite her heritage, and she was extremely grateful for that. He probably also wanted her back in his bed, despite her heritage. But it would be no more than a fling. Considering the way he felt about human war unions, the much-honored Colin MacDowell, Laird of Glenbarra, would certainly seek a full-blooded were as his mate. That female were probably would have to be born and bred in the Highlands too, and hail from a respectable pack with a coat of arms and such other trappings as they had over in Scotland. Luna had known from the beginning that Colin couldn't be more than a passing lover in the night. Still, she had to admit that was more than she'd had before he'd arrived on the scene, relieved her of the burden of her virginity, and taught her that she wouldn't shift or explode during an orgasm. Colin definitely had some pluses on his side. If he had a strong prejudice against wars mating with humans that really had nothing to do with her or their extremely temporary relationship, he was an outstanding lover, or so she supposed, having so little experience in the matter. By denying him sex, she was also denying herself. Her mother would have said that was cutting off her nose to spite her face. She just discovered that orgasms were extremely pleasurable. Why not take advantage of what this virile war had to offer on her terms? Colin cleared his throat. So, she looked into those damnably attractive blue eyes. I'll think about the whole grandparent angle. No promises, but I'll give it some thought. Good. And much as I'd love to have Knox point out the wonders of flying over the sound at night, I'd rather not go back at midnight. Colin sighed. All right. I'll cancel the restaurant reservations and call Knox. What time would you like to leave? She had a hard time controlling her smile, but she wanted to shock him. He deserved to be shocked, and a smile might tip him off that something unexpected was coming. How about late tomorrow morning? He looked as if she'd hit him with a 2x4. Chapter 13. Luna had rendered him speechless, and that didn't happen often to Colin MacDowell, Pack Alpha and Laird of Glenbarra. When he finally spoke, it was with a disconcerting stammer. Tea tomorrow. Unless y'all have plans. Triumph danced in her green eyes. She'd gained the upper hand and she knew it. No, I just didn't come prepared. Neither did I. No extra clothes, although for some of the time we won't need any. He couldn't believe she'd said that. He hoped the limo driver was discreet, although he'd have to count on Knox's discretion too, because once he called Knox, the helicopter pilot would know bloody hell. The entire staff at Whittier House would know too. Not a soul would believe he and Luna had spent the night in separate hotel rooms. He swallowed. I assume you've thought this through? As a matter of fact, I have. When we get back to the city for our book shopping, we can stop by a department store and pick up a few things. I'll be happy with some jeans, a blouse, and a change of underwear. Can still wear my sandals, and I can go without makeup for a day. I have lipstick in my purse. That's not what I meant. Are you worried about toiletries? If we're staying in a luxury hotel, which seems to be the way y'all roll, then it should have everything else: shampoo, toothpaste, things like that. She shrugged. Easy. I'm not worried about any of that. For a chance to spend the whole night with her, he'd sacrifice any number of grooming essentials. I'm thinking of. It sounded old-fashioned, but he'd say it anyway. Your reputation. My reputation? She placed a hand dramatically on her chest. This can only improve it. Everyone thinks of me as a shy and boring virgin, and now they'll know I've finally taken the leap, and with a fine specimen too. Thanks for that, but I wouldn't say that I'm such a fine. Don't be modest. Every female at Whittier House is in agreement on that. Gore. You're gorgeous. Fact is, you should be worrying about your reputation. I should. Important Laird, Pack Alpha, consorting with the help, a female were who doesn't even belong to a pack and has a very murky history. How will that play in Glenbarra? So long as I'm not mated, and it's consensual, nobody cares. In that case, I need to get while the getting's good before Colin MacDowell is all mated up with a bonny lass and a pack of wee MacDowells. You sound mighty cheerful about that prospect. Why shouldn't I be? Isn't that what y'all want? It wasn't a question he cared to answer at the moment, because with Luna sitting inches away, her scent teasing him as much as her saucy words and outrageous suggestion to chuck everything and openly spend the night together, he couldn't seem to think about anything else, and certainly not about a life without her in it. Moving closer, he slid his hand under her silky hair to cup the back of her neck. Right now, all I want to do is kiss you. Right here in the limo? No, right here on the mouth. Leaning forward, he made good on that statement, and he couldn't remember a sweeter kiss than this one because he'd given up all hope of ever doing it again. He pulled back, and was gratified to notice that her pupils were huge and her breathing as jerky as his. "I don't mind if the world knows we're lovers," he said in a low voice. "But I'm not willing to put on a public demonstration to prove it." "Are we in public? I totally forgot." He smiled. "What a nice compliment. As I said, you're very good for my ego. No matter what our differences may be, Colin, you're the best kisser I've ever known. And my competition is who? The cretin who backed you up against a wall without asking and stuck his tongue down your throat? Face it, Luna, you don't know if I can kiss worth a damn. I'm just better than the Neanderthal who grabbed you years ago. I may not have kissed very many males in my life, but when someone can make me dizzy with only the pressure of his mouth, then I'll bet he's a good kisser." She leaned toward him and lowered her voice. "And besides being dizzy, my panties are wet." Colin groaned softly. "You shouldn't have told me that." "I'm only trying to prove my point," she murmured. "Yes, but..." He put his mouth close to her ear. "We just pulled into the parking lot of the hot tub dealership, and I'm not sure I can get out of the car." Her glance flicked to his lap and her smile was pure female. "Want to carry my purse?" "No, lass, I do not." He closed his eyes and ran through a few football stats. "Motion sickness," Colin said. "I'm fine now." "Yes, sir." The driver ducked his head, but not before Colin saw his knowing grin. No matter. Colin was Luna Reynaud's lover and didn't care who knew it, including no especially Knox Trevelyan. Luna was so glad she decided to put aside her grievances and enjoy being Colin's temporary lover. Shopping for a hot tub was way more fun when she could subtly taunt him with how they could make use of it. They actually might do those things too, because the salesman promised delivery by motor launch the following afternoon. She and Colin chose an above-ground model so it could be installed in a few hours. While the salesman drew up the paperwork, Colin pulled Luna aside. "You're a devil. You do know that, right?" "Me?" She batted her eyelashes at him. "I simply wanted to make sure the benches would be the right height and the jets were positioned well. And we needed a demonstration of the pulsing action." "That's very important." "I'm sure it is for what you have in mind. You don't play fair, Luna Reynaud." "Poor Colin. Bless your heart, that vein popped out on your temple when our salesman was explaining the pulsing action. I hope you realize that we're obligated to test that hot tub tomorrow night. I wouldn't feel right letting a guest use it until we're completely satisfied. As they say down in the French Quarter, touché." Now she was the one, feeling hot and bothered as she imagined them both naked in the hot tub. He'd agreed with her that it should be positioned beyond the croquet area on the edge of the bluff. Anyone sitting in it would have a view of the sea but be screened from the house by a row of tall hedges. Yet when she envisioned enjoying the tub with Colin, she wondered if they'd even care about the view. They'd have to make sure they tested it long after everyone else went to bed. Colin signed the papers and wrote a check out of Geraldine's retirement account. She'd made him the beneficiary of that, too. If he'd sold the island and everything on it, he would have ended up with a sizable amount of money. Instead, he was spending money to make Whittier House more attractive to guests. Luna thought about that as they climbed inside the limo. "I'll make this venture profitable," she said. "In the long run, y'all will make more money this way than by selling." He reached over and took her hand. "Don't worry." He stroked her palm with his thumb. "I won't regret hanging on to the place." "I hope not." The languid movement of his thumb reminded her of how he'd caressed her so intimately the last time they'd made love, when he refused to risk chafing her. She dropped her voice to a murmur. "I'm not sore, by the way." His thumb stopped in mid-motion. "You have the damnedest timing. Just when I was beginning to establish some control, you wreck it. I thought you'd want to know before we do anything." "Oh, I do want to know. Believe me, it's been on my mind ever since you mentioned staying overnight in Seattle." He squeezed her hand and released it. "Which reminds me that I need to call Knox and let him know our change of plans." "You sound quite pleased about that." "I am." He pulled his cell phone from an inside pocket of his jacket and punched in a number. "It will give me great pleasure to inform Knox that you and I will be spending the night together." "Hey." She poked him in the ribs. You're not allowed to be possessive. He had no right to lay a claim considering everything, but knowing he wanted to was gratifying. I know I shouldn't feel that way, he said softly, but I can't seem to. Help, Knox? Colin here. Listen, we've decided to stay over. Could you meet us at the helipad around? He glanced over at Luna and lifted his eyebrows. Noon. Around noon, Colin said. You can? Thanks. See you then. He disconnected the phone and tucked it inside his jacket. Then he settled back with what could only be described as a triumphant smile and recaptured Luna's hand. I have no sexual interest in Knox, she said. I probably shouldn't tell y'all that because it's sort of fun to watch the Laird of Glenbarra get jealous. I'm not jealous. Ha! I'm not. I was back when you were making eyes at Knox and he was showing off with his helicopter skills, but he was not showing off. He knows I love Orcus, and when he spotted a pot of them he simply made sure I got a good view. Because he wants your body. You don't know that. Yes, I do, lass. Male wers know these things about other male wers. Knox has noticed you. You're beautiful, funny, and smart. Any male with half a brain would want you. Warmth spread through her. Other females might be used to hearing this kind of thing, but she'd spent a lifetime avoiding such conversations. She drank in his compliments, but that didn't mean she had an interest in Knox. She liked him as a friend, and she valued the way he tried to save Geraldine, but she'd never reacted to him the way she had to Colin. From the moment Colin had walked into the entryway of Whittier House, she'd been entranced by him. She knew he wasn't a real possibility in the long run, but for the next few days he was all hers. And if he thought he had a rival in Knox Trevelyan, maybe she should keep her mouth shut and pretend that was the case. She didn't know much about male-female relationships, but instinctively she understood the advantages of being desired by more than one eligible were. With Knox potentially hovering in the background, Colin would try harder to please her. That could be good. Are you still up for a meeting with George Trevelyan? Colin asked as they neared the business district. Yes. She extracted her hand from his grip. But I need to repair my lipstick. Someone kissed it all off. Does it have a raspberry flavor? Or is that just you? She glanced at him. What if I said my mouth tastes naturally of raspberries? I'd believe you. It's not a stretch to think you're delicious all over. She wiggled happily in her seat as she imagined him enjoying every inch of her. In their shared hotel room. I'm really starting to enjoy this whole sexual thing. I wish I'd learned about it sooner. Opening her purse, she located her lipstick in a small mirror. Selfishly, I'm glad you didn't. She paused in the act of putting on her lipstick as she debating telling him the absolute truth. But he had been the first to give her an orgasm, so maybe he deserved the truth. I think holding off was a good thing for me. Y'all were the one I needed to learn from. I'm flattered. But the way things are going, the student is liable to outpace the teacher. She shook her head. There's so much I don't know, especially about how it works when we shift. I'm sure you can imagine. Her cheeks grew hot. In spite of all they'd shared, some subjects still made her feel shy. She was gaining confidence in human form, but as a were, she felt inexperienced and tentative. I can imagine, but I could be wrong. Tomorrow night, after we test out the hot tub, he murmured for her ears. Alone. We'll shift together and go for a run. Once we're in the forest, I'll show you what happens between two wers. Her heart pounded so loud she wondered if the chauffeur could hear it. I'd like that. She didn't dare put on her lipstick now or she'd smear it all over her face because her hands were shaking. You will like it, he said gently. The other is good, but making love as wers adds a whole other dimension. It is, of course, how wers bond when they mate, but of course we won't be doing that. Of course not, she said quickly. Still, she was curious about how a mating ritual was different from simply having were sex. I may never take part in that kind of bonding, but what happens exactly? I've never done it either, obviously, but as teens we all learned what takes place, so we'd be ready. The actual sex is the same, but the two were circle each other beforehand while they pledge their eternal faithfulness. A lump lodged in her throat. That sounds wonderful. And she wanted such a bonding, but she could only think of one where who would fill the bill. Maybe that was due to her lack of experience. When wers are truly mates, perhaps even soul mates, it is wonderful, or so I've heard. Hey, you'd better fix your lipstick. We're almost there. She'd been so wrapped up in the idea of mating words that she'd lost track of her original intention. Turning the base of the tube, she held the mirror in front of her mouth and outlined her top lip while doing her best to keep her hand steady. It's the lipstick, Colin said. It smells like raspberries. You found me out. She moved to her bottom lip. Colin put his head close to hers. I think I could come just watching you do that. Hot desire shot through her veins, but she pretended to be unaffected by his comment. Then y'all are easily stimulated. By you apparently. This isn't the first time I've watched someone put on lipstick, but it's the first time it's given me an erection. I can't stop thinking about you kneeling in front of me, with your mouth on my. Stop it, or we'll both be in trouble. I think we already are. She would agree with that, although her inexperience meant she couldn't judge whether the passion between them was off the charts. He'd admitted that the simple act of watching her apply lipstick was enough to set him off. That sounded like a strong attraction to her. The limo eased to a stop at the curb. Luna glanced out and couldn't understand why they were facing the same way they had when they'd left. Why aren't we across the street from the office building? He took a different route so he could deposit us right here and we wouldn't have to cross traffic. Luna blinked. Now that's what I call service. Knox told me that George runs a tight ship. Guess he was right. Wait, did you call to see if he's in? No, but I will once we're on the sidewalk. The chauffeur helped Luna out first, and she thanked him for driving them around as Colin climbed from the limo and pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket. Moments later he appeared at her elbow. We're all set with George. Then he put some bills in the chauffeur's hand. I appreciate your fine service, he said. You're welcome. The chauffeur's eyes lit up at the sight of the money. And your discretion, Colin added. Absolutely, sir. Will you be needing a limo anymore during your stay in Seattle? Colin glanced at Luna. If we decide to pay a visit to your grandparents tomorrow, then we'll take a regular taxi, Luna said. I refuse to drive up to their house in a white stretch limo. All right. Colin turned back to the chauffeur. Then I guess we won't be needing you again. Thanks for everything. Yes, sir. With a smile, the chauffeur returned to his limo. Taking Luna's hand, Colin started toward the imposing entrance to the building. While I was talking to George, I asked him to book us a room at his favorite hotel in the city. Why did y'all do that? Because if I hadn't, he'd take one look at you and wonder what I was waiting for. As I said, single wers are expected to enjoy their sexuality. Then I guess it's a good thing I suggested spending the night. Yes. He glanced down at her and his eyes glowed with blue fire. It's a very good thing. Chapter 14. Colin had communicated with George Trevelyan several times through both email and phone conversations, but this was their first face-to-face meeting. After the glittering lobby, Colin had expected more of the same in George's office, but the Alpha were surprised him. The room had a rustic feel, as if they'd stepped into a lodge built by one of the Pacific Northwest tribes. An intricately carved totem pole stood in a corner to the right of George's desk. Not surprisingly, it contained a stylized wolf's head at the top. Other pieces of Native American art decorated the walls, and many of those depicted wolves as part of the design. The wall to their left held no hanging art, but instead featured a mural with Mount Rainier in the background and a pack of wolves in the foreground. A casual visitor would call this a flight of fancy. Officially, no wolf packs lived west of the Cascade Mountains. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind George's desk offered a view of the distant peak depicted in the mural. George himself looked like a rugged outdoorsman more than the CEO of Trevelyan Enterprises. Because it was a regular work day, Colin assumed that George always dressed casually. He wore jeans and a green flannel shirt open at the neck, as if he might head out for a hike at any minute. At 50-something he was fit, with only touches of gray in his dark hair. Colin hoped to look that good in 20 years. George stood and came around the massive desk to greet them. He took Luna's hand first and focused all his attention on her. Luna Reynaud. It's a pleasure to meet you. Colin was glad George was mated and nearly twice Luna's age, because if he hadn't been, Colin would have bristled at the warmth of George's greeting. He seemed ready to eat Luna up with a spoon. George continued to hold her hand as he piled on the charm. My Aunt Edwina married a Reynaud. You're not related by any chance, are you? Colin sucked in a breath and cursed himself for not digging a little deeper. Worse yet, he was the idiot who'd pushed Luna into coming up here to meet George. Without realizing it, he'd thrown her into the deep end of the pool, and he had no idea if she would sink or swim. Then to his relief, she came up with a brilliant response. I'm not really sure, but I've been meaning to check into that. She sounded completely at ease. Please do. George released her hand. Edwina and Jacques haven't had an easy time of it. Their only child, my cousin Byron, was killed in his early 20s many years ago. They've carried on bravely since then, but I'm sure they'd welcome more family connections. Then I'll definitely follow up. Colin noticed the faint tremor in her voice, but he'd come to know her well in the short time they'd been together. George probably wouldn't hear it. Next, George held out his hand to Colin. We meet at last, MacDowell. I've promised myself I'd come over there and play golf the way it was meant to be played, but I haven't made it yet. When you do, I'll be happy to swing a club with you. I'll make it one day. George shook a finger in warning. But I'm a lousy golfer, so you may not want to admit you know me. He swept a hand toward two cushy leather armchairs in front of his desk. Sit down, please. I want to hear all about the plans for Whittier House. Luna sat, but Colin chose to perch on the wide arm of the other chair. It was our thing. George had leaned a hip against the front edge of his desk in a very casual way. But the stance was far from casual. If Colin sat down in the squashy chair, he would no longer be able to look George in the eye. He might be younger than George, and he might not command George's great wealth, but his title equaled George's. The Laird of Glenbarra would never put himself in an inferior position to another alpha. Luna, of course, was oblivious to all this jockeying. She immediately began describing her vision for the inn, and Colin listened with pride. It was a terrific concept, so terrific that he almost wished he'd thought of it himself. George looked impressed. When I first talked to Colin, he seemed hell-bent on selling the place, but this is a far better idea. I can understand why he went for it. Colin thought there might be a double meaning there. George could see that Luna was a charmer, and he also knew, following the request for a hotel room, that Colin was sleeping with her. But Colin's relationship with Luna didn't take anything away from the brilliance of her business plan. Wers don't have very many resorts strictly dedicated to them, Colin said. The island is perfect, isolated with woods to roam in, yet with all kinds of amenities for those seeking luxury. Luna and I just bought a hot tub for the premises at her suggestion. We plan to have a well-stocked library, complimentary cocktail hour every evening, and croquet tournaments. He'd thrown that last bit in, and Luna looked somewhat startled to hear it. But she wanted to keep the croquet playing field, and tournaments sounded like a crowd pleaser. Sounds terrific. I'd like to buy in, George asked. Colin winced. He should have anticipated this, and he hadn't. That's a great offer, and I'll keep it in mind, but we're going to go it alone at least initially. Now that Whittier House belonged to him, he wanted to keep it that way. It was his project, his and Luna's. But he couldn't predict the future, and alienating someone like George was never good business. But if I change my mind about that, you'll be the first person I call. Make sure I am. And I'd like to be on the guest list for the opening weekend as well. I already told Suzanne what was happening out there, and she's wild to finally get the chance to see the island and the castle Henry built for Geraldine. She thinks it's a romantic story. So do I, Luna said. In fact, I'd like to bill Whittier House as a romantic getaway if Colin is willing to use that as a marketing hook. Absolutely. Colin turned to George. As you can see, Luna has good instincts. And a great southern accent, George added with a benevolent smile. Where's your family from, Luna? Once again, Colin held his breath, not having any idea how Luna would handle such questions. He knew they were loaded, but George might not. Or maybe he did. George was nobody's fool, and once he'd heard about the inn concept, he'd obviously thought of investment opportunities. Following that, he would have done a background check on both Colin and Luna. He would have run into some dead ends with Luna. Colin had done a similar search this morning and had netted very little. I grew up in New Orleans for the most part, she said. But my parents didn't like to stay in one place, so we didn't belong to one particular pack. Regret that now. Colin admired how she told the truth, but it was only true when interpreted a certain way. Her parents literally hadn't stayed in one place together. Her mother had moved to New Orleans, and her father had stayed in Seattle in a matter of speaking. His ashes were scattered somewhere, and that was another thing Luna deserved to know about. A connection with her grandparents would be so rewarding if it worked out. A nomadic were family. George sounded intrigued. Did you inherit that tendency? For a time, Luna said, when I was younger. But once I took the job with Geraldine, I found my home. I have no desire to live anywhere else. Colin had known she felt that way from the beginning, yet to hear her say it drove another nail in the coffin of his fantasy that somehow, someway they could end up together in Scotland. The idea made no sense, yet he wasn't sure how he'd live out the rest of his days without her. That's good to hear, George said. I'm all in favor of having a destination resort here in the Seattle area. Those Colorado wers have the only one so far, and they're raking in the profits. That proves there's a market for it. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help get this off the ground. He pushed away from his desk. Colin read that as a signal that the visit was over. Standing, he offered a hand to Luna. She accepted it because the chair was extremely deep. Colin hated to think of how he would have lost status if he'd sat in the other one. He doubted George had expected him to. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Luna said as she shook George's hand. It's important to have friends in the community when you're launching a new business. I have a feeling you'll be very successful. George released her hand and glanced over at Colin. The reservations made, by the way, and the rooms paid for with my compliments. Colin frowned. You didn't have to do that. Just promise you'll get me a tea time at St. Andrews when I show up there. And we'll call it even. I'll do that. Colin shook George's hand, and the interview was over. When they were in the elevator headed back down to the lobby, Luna sagged against the mirrored elevator wall. That was challenging. Colin put an arm around her shoulders and hugged her close. You were amazing. She glanced up at him, a gleam of suspicion in her eyes. Did y'all know my grandmother was his aunt? I didn't, and I apologize for that. Please believe that if I'd known I would have warned you. If I'd known, I wouldn't have gone up there. But you did, and you impressed him. He'll support your business, and that kind of support could make a big difference. She sighed. Until he finds out that I'm the illegitimate child of his late cousin Byron. Her eyes widened. I think that means I'm related to George Trevelyan. I wondered when you'd figure that out. She closed her eyes. All I ever wanted was to hide out on that island, and that's looking increasingly impossible. I'm a part of the Trevelyan pack, whether I want to be or not, and eventually that will come out. Leaning down, he dropped a kiss on the top of her head. Have you ever thought that maybe you weren't meant to hide out somewhere? That you were meant for something more grand than living like a hermit on La Florette? Y'all make it sound like some kind of destiny or something. Maybe it is, Luna. He thought about the premonition he'd had when he'd realized that her name blended perfectly with his cherished love of the heavens. Maybe it is. Luna's mood improved once she and Colin left the Trevelyan Enterprises building. She had to make a decision about whether or not to visit her grandparents, but she didn't have to make it now. Instead, she and Colin could explore Seattle, and the city in June was a magical place, especially for lovers. Much as she'd adored Geraldine, Colin was a more exciting companion. He insisted on going into an upscale department store to buy the clothes they'd need for the following day. He bought sensible things, a change of underwear and a cotton shirt, but he nagged her mercilessly until she ended up with a pair of designer jeans and a ridiculously expensive silk blouse that matched her eyes. Or so Colin said when she walked out of the dressing room wearing it. He took part in choosing her underwear too, and so naturally it was black lace. Why do males have this thing about black lace? She asked him after they left the lingerie department, each with their purchases in a snazzy bag with handles. Conditioning, I suppose. He laced his fingers through hers as they strolled along the sidewalk toward Pike's Place Market, where they planned to browse through some bookshops. Black is the color of night, of mystery, of the forbidden. She laughed and swung her shopping bag back and forth, feeling carefree and slightly decadent. I don't remember forbidding anything to y'all. A pretty much given the Laird of Glenbarra carte blanche. And I hope you know that I don't take that lightly, especially considering. I know. And I appreciate it. Her heart softened. Colin had his flaws, but at his core he was inherently decent. You'd have every right to forbid me everything, and yet, generous female that you haven't. Don't give me too much credit. I'm getting something out of the arrangement, too. I hope so. He lifted her hand and dropped a gentle kiss on the inside of her wrist. She shivered in delight. The Laird of Glenbarra did have a boatload of charm. You fascinated me since the moment you walked through the door of Whittier House. And I was fascinated with you from the beginning too. You were the prettiest I'd ever seen, and your laughter was balm to my soul. I'm glad. She was so unused to getting compliments from male Wers that each one Colin gave her seemed like a glittering jewel presented in a velvet box. They reached the market, a covered row of shops and stalls selling everything under the sun it seemed. Fish, vegetables, flowers, new age products, antiques, crafts. Luna was on sensory overload. And somewhere in this visual kaleidoscope was a bookstore. Colin had looked it up. What was everyone laughing about that morning anyway? He asked. I meant to ask you that before. It was. She was embarrassed to think how stupid that conversation had been. But at the time they'd all been so tense that everything had seemed funny. It was nothing. Ah, come on, Luna. He squeezed her hand. Let me in on the joke. It won't be funny anymore, but all right. We were confused about Scottish titles and thought a laird might logically have a lairdess, which somebody mispronounced as lardass, and Janet started prancing around with her bottom stuck out. She snuck a glance at him. See? Not funny. He grinned. Oh, it's funny. Especially when I visualize Janet putting on a demonstration. If the question ever comes up again, the proper term is lady, not lairdess. Well, that's easy enough to remember. She, for one, would never forget it. Knowing the title his mate would hold made it very clear to her that he would move on, and she would not move on with him. Her happy mood dimmed a fraction. She might be his lover now, but she would never be his lady. And despite understanding completely why that was so, she couldn't help being sad about that. Luna. She looked at him and forced herself to smile. What? I just wondered. You were quiet all of a sudden. She grabbed the first evasive comment that came to mind. I was just thinking about something. Must have been a serious subject. Sorry. Didn't mean to be a Debbie Downer. Who? American slang. It means someone who looks on the negative side of everything and ruins the mood. She brought up a topic that she knew interested him. Here's a thought. What if Edwina and Jacques Reynaud come here to shop? She could let him assume she'd been dwelling on a potential visit to her grandparents. She would never ever admit that she fantasized about being his mate. It wouldn't work, and she should just quit torturing herself about it. They might shop here, he said. It's obviously a popular place. They could even be here now. We could walk right past them and I'd never. No. I have a picture of their house on my phone. Really? Can I see it? She was legitimately interested in that. With Colin here to give her courage, she might even decide to go see them tomorrow. Maybe. It was time to slay this dragon once and for all. Of course. I wasn't sure if you'd want to. He reached inside his jacket for his phone. Wait. Don't take out your phone in the middle of this crowd. We need to keep moving or we'll get trampled to death. I can look at it once we're in the bookstore. Fair enough. And speaking of the bookstore, there it is. He pointed to there. Right, and they ducked inside. Luna took a deep breath. Ah, love that smell. Then maybe I'll buy a really old tattered book and rub it all over myself. Tonight. She laughed and glanced around to see if anyone had heard that remark. Nobody seemed to be paying any attention. The clerks were busy ringing up purchases. And the browsers all had that dreamy expression found on the faces of true book lovers surrounded by the objects of their affection. She leaned close to Colin. I seem to remember y'all also love the smell of old books. I do. He gazed down at her, amusement in his blue eyes. I'd suggest scattering pages all over the bed so we can roll around in them, but that would require destroying a book, and I'm not sure I can do that. I couldn't either, but it's fun to think about. Like a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover. We could stop every once in a while and read a page for inspiration. I can't speak for you, but I don't seem to require more inspiration in your presence. In fact, if we stand here talking about this much longer, I'll have to browse the shelves holding a shopping bag in front of my crotch. Don't blame me, your lairdness. I'm not the one who started this conversation. By mentioning that I might rub book pages all over my naked body. I didn't use the word naked. No, but it was implied, and I have reactions too for your information. You do. He let go of her hand and wrapped his long fingers around her upper arm. Then come with me, little girl. I have some books I want to show you. She allowed herself to be pulled up and down the aisles until he found one that was deserted. Then he set down his shopping bag and pulled her into his arms. I wanted to do this when we were in Henry's library together, but I didn't, so I'm making up for it now. Lowering his head, he kissed her with such focus and intensity that her shopping bag slid from her limp fingers and hit the floor with a soft thump. She didn't bother to pick it up.